Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. And it's great to have you here for another episode of our Massey Dialogues with wonderful guests discussing some serious issues about how do cultural workers organize what is media and digital world colliding and what indeed can be done about this. So I first want to just acknowledge that Massey College, where we are today with our live audience, is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and also the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Dawn of Hall, Christine Tran, whose ideas it is to create this dialogue, and I want to thank her for her leadership on this question. Bon après-midi.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. Hello, everybody. My name is Christine Tran. I am a doctoral researcher at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, where I look at digital labor, live streaming, and social media. Now, the past 20 months have reinforced the importance of having a well-resourced digital journalistic workforce to support public communication between policymakers, healthcare providers, and the general public. As the professionals on this panel know, this type of news information doesn't happen naturally. It is work. So this dialogue asks you to think about news workers and journalists as that, workers. We ask you to visualize the human lives doing this work and the conditions in which they do it, which have been, in our culture, have been hyper-normalized in a culture of low wage and precarious employment. Since 2015, more than 60 newsrooms across North America have responded to this widespread precarity by unionizing their digital workplaces. This includes digital native outlets such as BuzzFeed, as well as legacy operations like The New Yorker, and more recently the efforts of Wirecutter, who have recently just finished, I believe, their Cyber Week strike while negotiating with their employer, The New York Times. Now, we bring today on this panel titled Cultural Workers Organize, we bring these multiple perspectives from journalism, scholarship, labor organizing, and within the newsroom itself to ask, can journalists ever seize these means of news production? How does this movement of labor action fit into the broader worker movements currently happening from all across not only the media economy, but the global workforce itself? Today, I am joined by our three lovely esteemed guests. We have at the end there Wenxi Leung, our 2022 Webster McConnell Journalism Fellow at Massey College. She is a Toronto-based health reporter for the Globe and Mail and has a special interest in reporting on matters of brain health. Prior to joining the Globe, she worked at the Prague Post, the Vancouver Sun, the Cambodia Daily, and the Reuters News Agency. Thanks for joining us, Wenxi. And to my left, your right, I assume, we have Dr. Nicole Cohen. She is an associate professor at the Institute of Communication, Culture, and Technology and the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. She is author of the award-winning monograph Writer's Rights, Freelance Journalism in a Digital Age, and is co-author with Greg DePuter of New Media Unions, Organizing Digital Journalists. And in the interest of transparency, she is also my PhD supervisor. Thanks for coming. Thank you for coming, Nicole. And thank you for everything, Nicole. Really. And right in the middle of me, at least, we have Nasser Ahmed, who is a worker organizer with the media union CWA Canada. As a former media worker himself, Nasser strongly believes that all media workers deserve to have union representation. In the face of an unstable media landscape where workers are often left to bear the brunt of media organizations, I love your quotes here, restructuring, Nasser and the CWA Canada are fighting to preserve sustainable jobs in media because quality jobs means quality journalism. Nasser is a former producer at CBC Toronto and the current vice president for young workers at the Ontario Federation of Labour. Thank you so much for coming, Nasser. Thank you all of you for coming. So I shall start by asking you where you are exactly coming from. I'm interested in structuring this panel around the organization of journalism labor as a job in the past, present, and future. So not easy, just a simple question here. And since you decided to self-identify as journalistic workers, how was to you the concept of the definition of a career in journalism redefined and developed since you began your careers? Nasser, I feel you have hot opinions on this.
Yeah, I think, look, not to be negative about it necessarily right off the bat, but I think, certainly the industry has been in transition for quite some time now, and we have seen some negative trends start to arise, right? Things like the rise of basically permalancing, right? Where if you're going to be a media worker at this point, like, get used to freelancing, right? It's a permanent state of your employment at this stage, right? And almost even worse, I would say, is we're seeing a bottlenecking happen, right? Where, look, at the end of the day, anybody can go to school for this. Anybody can probably get that first job right out of school for this, right? But how do you build sustainability into that career? That's what's really tough about this. That's what we're seeing for a lot of young journalists. A lot of my job is working with specifically young journalists, people straight out of school, and burnout is one of the hardest things that they're experiencing. They're grinding themselves to a nub right out of school. And what you're seeing is, if you want to have 10 years in this business, 15 years in this business, it's basically reserved for the ones who are wealthy enough to afford that. And that is really one of the most, I think, nefarious trends that we're seeing, is this furthering of a bottleneck in the industry for who can actually stay there. Which I think overall the most ironic thing is you see, newsrooms everywhere, right? What's been the big push the last decade? It's been, we got to diversify the newsroom. We got to diversify the newsroom. Well, is it really diverse if people from different socioeconomic backgrounds can't be in that newsroom? Like, I don't want to be too forward here, but I don't really care if they look like me, but if they all went to the same private school, right? So I know that's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but these are some of the negative trends that we are seeing in the industry. And again, I hate to start off on a negative note, because there are also positives, of course, but I think those are really important things to discuss in terms of how it's changed over the last decade or so.
Thank you, Nasser.
Just to jump on that, not necessarily, we do tend to see a bit more diversity in newsrooms, but that tends to be at the entry level and not in higher upper level and management levels. But,
yeah, I mean, I guess I'll say when I was a journalism student, I used to go to the world's biggest bookstore. Do you remember that? It's no longer exists. Look at the magazine rack and think, oh my gosh, like there must be so many places to work. There must be so many jobs. I had no idea how magazines are produced, right, historically on freelance labor. But I think what we're seeing now is like there's so many media outlets. There's an explosion of content. Like more content is being produced than ever before, I think, on like a global scale. And we do see like an opening of the media industry to more diverse perspectives and people. But at the same time, journalism has become much more precarious than it ever has been. So like these two things happening at the same time speak to the widespread nature of precarious work, low-wage work, just really insecure work, in a kind of what seems like a booming ecosystem. Like I imagine young journalists looking out and being like, I could work anywhere, right? It's sort of not that case.
And if I can quickly just add on to that, I think that's a great point that, in terms of actual content that's out there, right, and it's being engaged with, like it's correct. There's more than ever. We're consuming more than ever, right? We walk around with little computers in our pockets all day long, constantly engaging with media. So, just to counteract some of the negative stuff I was saying earlier, like it's not a question of resources, why these things are happening, these negative trends that we're seeing. It's a question of the allocation of those resources, right? At the end of the day, if companies like Postmedia, right, who have essentially a monopoly over print media in this country, if they can shut down papers left, right, and center, particularly out west, and create basically news deserts in parts of the country, you have to question how can they afford to give their shareholders and their CEO like basically $1 million bonuses at the end of every year, right? The money is there. People are engaging with this content. The money is there. It's not a question of resources. It's how those resources are being allocated. So it's an important note to keep in mind.
Thank you, everyone, for setting such an optimistic scene, a stage to this conversation. I love it. So another question I have is, like, from your various perspectives, like right now, what myths about journalism and media work would you like to bust at this moment? What misconceptions would you like to reconceive, if that's the word? Any myth? Wency from the news, the one working in a newsroom right now.
I think, one thing that I would like to see is a bit of a separation between how people. Okay, so let me back up. I think one of the myths is that we're so lucky to be journalists, and in a way, we are lucky to be journalists. I'm really lucky to have a job. I'm lucky to have benefits and all the rest. The issue, though, that I see with that is that, you know, when you feel lucky to even just be working, that can cause some problems in terms of labor, because you know, it means you're willing to put in overtime without claiming it, and it means you know, I'm guilty of this, and I know a lot of my colleagues are guilty of this too, having this mentality that because we're lucky to do this and we have a responsibility to do the work that we do, that we're willing to do it unpaid. And that tends to happen.
Yeah, I think that's vital. And what I would say is that journalism is not work, that it's a profession, it's an occupation, it's a calling, it's a passion, it's a labor of love. And I think the whole panel is framed around recognizing that journalism is work, but once you start recognizing it as such, you start questioning the long hours, the unpaid overtime, the inability to separate work and life. And I think you start asking much more critical questions about like where the resources are being allocated and who's benefiting from the system as it exists. So I'd frame it in that way, similar to what Wency's saying.
Yeah, and one thing just to add to Nicole's point, which I love this idea that we need journalists to start viewing themselves as workers, right? Like, and again, let me preface it by saying, like, I'm not sure how much of a myth it is anymore necessarily.
That's true.
But it definitely has been for a long time. Not only for the great reasons that Nicole listed, but the simple fact that when you start looking at yourself and the work that you do as a cultural worker rather than, like you said, a media professional or an urban professional or whatever, some folks might have called themselves, it actually connects you. It helps bridge you to the broader labor movement as well, right? Like, we need to stop looking at, the coal miners and factory workers are over there fighting their fight, and us in tech are doing our thing. Like, it's not true, right? These fights, these struggles are intertwined, and we need to start looking at them that way. And I think the other thing I would add to this is that, again, not sure how much it's still a pervasive myth. Certainly, when I talk to, I think, younger journalists is where I really see this kind of starting to be busted, is rethinking objectivity, right? Not abandoning it, but rethinking its place in journalism as sort of, I think, what it's always been, the sort of be-all and end-all. The thing that gave you integrity as a journalist was your amount of objectivity. And we can go down the rabbit hole of like the impact it has on the work itself, and that is a conversation to be had. But I think for this conversation, looking at it as objectivity has always been this thing that has kind of prevented a lot of journalists from being more active participants in the communities around them, right? So whether that was in a political sense or in the very real sense of their own working lives. And I think that's one of the most important things we're seeing is that you can be a good journalist, you can be objective in your work and still not like to be mistreated at work, right? You can be active in your union, you can be at the bargaining table and then go do a great story, right? And so I think that is one of the myths that's I think really starting to be busted, and I'm really happy that it is.
Thank you, everybody. And on that, now heading to like the topic, now that we've really dug into we've agreed, journalistic labor is labor, real work, etc. Now about the and as I prefaced at the beginning of this panel, a lot of this was thinking about the recent wave of journalist newsroom unions we've been seeing in the past half decade. And I was wondering across the board, how would you, what do you make of that? What would you comment right now are the particular social things bolstering the rise in digital unions we've seen, and what challenges do you think that movement will face? I would like to start with Nicole, who wrote a book on this.
Yeah, and if anybody wants a copy, I'm happy to send them a PDF. Okay, I guess I'll say, so the first part of the question, like what's leading to this surge of unionizing, and actually since that number of 60 is from when we published our book, I think it's 133-ish newsrooms in North America have unionized since 2015. So that's thousands and thousands of media workers, and I think it's been extra high during the pandemic, which is really interesting. There's many different reasons, but I think that this idea that Nasser has brought up about questioning objectivity is part of it, and I think it's linked to like this sort of political change over the past, I don't know, few years with Occupy Wall Street and Bernie Sanders and Black Lives Matter. like in a kind of renewed feminist politics. I think that that has led a lot of young journalists to really question some of the assumptions that we've been talking about and some of the questions, and really thinking of themselves as workers and in these particular power dynamics, and being able to then think, well, okay, so this problem of working for free or working overtime, or I'm getting paid less than my colleague who does the same job beside me, that's not a me issue. It's not like me needing to work harder, but it's related to the structural nature of media. And that's really led thousands, like, I don't know what the number is. Do you know, Nasser? Like
don't know exactly,
8,000-ish, maybe 7,000 workers to unionize. And these are workers who have never been in unions before, let alone organized one from scratch. So yeah, it's quite a important, I think, shift.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that idea, I think it's really important what you highlighted, Nicole. Like, let's not view what we're seeing, which is a wave of organizing, genuinely, right? Let's not view it through a vacuum, right? Like, it's not independent of the social sort of happenings that's happening to everybody, right? Like, this wave of organizing is sort of a part of history. It's a part of the trends we're seeing in society writ large, right? Like, as life itself becomes more precarious, and you go down the list, whether it's an erosion, a further erosion of the social safety net, it's rents increasing, all of these things that are kind of laying on top of one another at the same time, like, it's the reason this mass politicization is happening, right? And journalism and the journalists themselves who are organizing are just one part of that. So I think it's important to kind of like broaden that lens, step back a little bit, and understand that this is a societal trend that we're actually seeing. And the only thing I'll add to that is, I think it's naive to think that simply because attitudes are changing and social conditions are worsening, that automatically it's going to magically lead to better things. You know what I mean? Like, I think sometimes a lot of people can go down that road of, I think, wishful thinking a little bit. That, like, well, things are getting worse and people are getting angry, so next domino is things get better. No, I think it leads up to opportunities. It leads to many opportunities to actually organize, to find issues that bridge people together, to bridge communities that might have otherwise, felt like they were at odds over certain things. It presents a bunch of opportunities to make things better. So I think that's an important distinction, is that just because these attitudes are changing doesn't mean we're going to see what we want, but it leads us down a road of a new path of opportunities to try and get there.
I think on that, though, too, is like, even if you have a newsroom that has a union, you still have these sort of pervasive attitudes around, like about working for free, like claiming overtime, kind of the sort of murky space between the work-life balance. These kinds of attitudes are still very, very, very much part of newsroom culture, and like, I think even when you have a union, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have these protections. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are actually exercising them too.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought these cultural changes. We often think of unionizing in this adversarial relationship between like worker and employer, but like, how do you frame an adversarial relationship, or rather like negotiate your own culture, right? Which leads to my question that digs into the digital nature of this conversation. So what do you think about, and it was discussed earlier by Nasser, about what is your relationship to the idea that journalists are becoming another genre of digital content creator? Like, now you only, it's pretty normalized for journalists to be quote unquote terminally online on Twitter and other platforms. And for example, in my own workspace, I know a lot of game streamers whose quote day jobs include being game journalists or general game industry personalities that takes that media labor across different platforms. So I was wondering, given this new multi-websited working condition of contemporary journalism, what is the role of media and unions in organizing a workplace when your workspace is the web and being around? Nasser.
Oh. Yeah, it's a big question. It's a loaded question. I think it's a good question. I think the best way I can try to answer that is like let's break it down a little, right? Like, I think there are differences in the nature of folks who are, for lack of a better term, terminally online for work. There's sort of the more formal style of journalistic employment. Let's say you work at some newspaper or you work for a news station, and part of that employment now is you got to engage with people online. That's part of your job now. And I think in that sense, it leads you to the more traditional avenues of, well, like, look, if you're going to double up my work, we got to renegotiate, right? And so I think in that sense, it does present, at least looking at this through a labor lens, the lens of a union, it provides you the chance to renegotiate, because you cannot all of a sudden double the scope of my job without me having a say over how much I'm going to be paid for this, or what the conditions are in which I'm going to actually do this work. I think where it gets a lot trickier is when you look at folks who are genuine content creators. That's their job, right? Like, I have friends who, you know, they got really big on Instagram doing makeup, right? And they put out hours and hours and hours of content, and they have racked up hundreds and thousands of followers, millions of views. The problem here is, like, who's their boss? It's an algorithm. That's their boss. How do you negotiate with an algorithm? Right? And it's not as simple as it sounds, because at the end of the day, you know, let's say you have built up this profile, you've built up this audience, you've only done that because you've posted daily for the last 6 years. What happens when I need a month-long vacation? Well, that algorithm bumps me down because I didn't post for a month, right? Say someone has a genuine mental health crisis, or, you know, God forbid, a physical health crisis, right? All of a sudden, I'm going to start being knocked down a peg each time that happens. And there's nothing I can really say or do about it with, you know, an employer, because again, that employer is an algorithm. So, you know, if anyone on this panel has any ideas about how we approach that, I'm all for it. But it's a really complicated question that I think even media unions need to really grapple with in the near future, because it's certainly not something that's going away. I think it's only going to kind of continue to proliferate and be a more sort of omnipresent thing in you know, our digital lives. So. It's an important question, but certainly not one I don't think we have all the answers to. Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead?
Do I want to? Well, yeah. I mean, I went into journalism not to be like tweeting and posting on LinkedIn or whatever it is. So I mean, that's not the nature of the work that I feel that I do, and I think the push to have journalists be engaging on social media all the time has, like, there are two kind of risks. You know, one is the idea of, like, you know, when does your day start, really? That kind of gets into a murky territory. And the other two is, like, you know, where do you end and your work begins? Like, where if I tweet something that my employer is not happy about, you know, that can get me into a whole world of trouble. So that also is, like, you know, kind of a tricky territory.
Speaking of murky waters, right? Who owns it, right? If I built up 75,000 followers on this Twitter account, but it has CNN at the end of it, and then I leave CNN, well, who owns this Twitter account? Right? I did all that work, right? These are big questions. It's tough.
But I think so. I think one thing that's important to remember is that journalists who have unionized have been able to because they have been in employment relationships. Like, maybe the nature of the work has changed and the pressures have changed, but there's an identifiable employer, you're in a full-time employment relationship, there's an infrastructure, a labor regime, so that enables you to organize. And I think what's interesting, if you read the collective bargaining agreements that people are negotiating, is that social media is being recognized as a space where that work is carried out. So as Nasser says, then you can negotiate the scope, like, you know, that becomes something you can bring to the bargaining table. And I think this is really important, especially around issues of harassment for racialized journalists and women in particular, that if, you know, when I interviewed journalists in I don't remember when this was, 2016, anyway, about their work in the newsroom, a lot of them were like, you know, I'm constantly harassed. My company is totally hands off. I have no recourse other than my friends or my editor to support me. Whereas now you see that there's provisions being negotiated into collective bargaining agreements. Now that takes to Wency's previous point, like mobilization. It's not just like, oh, the union, here's my great contract, right? Like, that's another story. But I think it's really interesting to see how the terrain of labor relations is shifting as the work changes. But that's, yeah, for employees who are able to form a bargaining unit.
Thank you so much for bringing up that formal, informal employment relationship, Nicole. So I will reward you by directing this new question first at you, because you also wrote a book about freelancing. The question of how these questions of formal collective bargaining and unionization, how do they or can they service the large wealth of freelance journalists currently producing content in our journalistic labor pool. One of my favorite parts of Nicole's book, Writer's Rights, was pointing out etymologically that word freelance has its origins in like mercenary work, hence like I'm a freelance for hire.
You'll fight any side on the war, right?
Oh, let's talk about that. Do you think that, so to return to journalistic freelancing, what do you make of these movements servicing freelancers, and also do you think freelancing is an inherently exploitative or mercenary relationship? Like, is there a way to provide this worker support and solidarity to freelance journalists who maybe, for perhaps good reasons, would prefer a employment relationship outside the formal ones offered by newsrooms?
Those are very big questions. I'll try to be quick. I'll say I don't know that freelancing is inherently exploitative. I think the way it's currently organized in capitalist media, it absolutely is, right? It's a very cheap form of labor, whether or not you want to freelance, and it benefits you to have a flexible schedule, etc. And yeah, it's true that they can't unionize for the purposes of collective bargaining, but I think, historically, and in Canada since like the 70s, maybe even earlier, freelancers have been collectively coming together to try and find ways to support one another and address these poor working conditions. So either a lack of contracts or low wages or not being paid on time. And there's kind of a resurgence now, I would say, in the US in particular, but also in Canada a little bit, about trying to find supports for freelancers and to open it up to all sorts of media freelancers. So maybe you write, but you do podcasting and you're a makeup artist on the side, to kind of recognize these new hybrid occupations people have. And yeah, they're not sitting down at a table to negotiate, although they're doing some interesting agreements with certain publications. But it's more about, I think, like solidarity organizing, coming together to support one another, to share information, to pressure companies to pay people on time, to share information about how much you can get paid. So there's ways that freelancers do it, and I think Nasser's work is a very excellent example of that. So maybe you'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. No, I think those are all great points in terms of in the absence of better labor laws, basically, media unions are trying to do what they can, right? I think, the CWA Canada affiliated Canadian Freelance Guild being one of those, right, trying to provide so many of those services that Nicole was talking about. But, it's a real conversation to have for that, as long as labor law allows for freelancers to be kept separate from any kind of these formal agreements. The type of organizing that's done around freelancers will remain sort of this kind of solidarity organizing, which is still excellent, right? Still good work to be done, but at the end of the day, your bargaining power still remains whatever you can negotiate on your own as an individual. And obviously, that's one of the primary benefits of belonging to a union, is that you can bargain and negotiate for more together than you ever could by yourself, right? So, until there's some kind of drastic change to labor law, in that sense, it will be limited to that type of solidarity organizing. The only thing I'll add to that is, speaking of the idea of labor law, the unfortunate part of where so many people who are sort of engaged in this less formal kind of employment arrangement are seeing is that there's a rampant issue of misclassifications happening in the industry, right? People who are being wrongfully classified, or I should say misclassified as an independent contractor, let's say. Whereas otherwise, if you go down the checklist, they should be an employee, right? They're getting the primary amount of their income through this employer. They're using equipment that is from this employer, right? There's an entire checklist we use legally to figure this stuff out. And really the problem is this is a really nefarious new business model that it didn't start in journalism either, right? This is kind of how Uber built their empire, by wrongfully, misclassifying their drivers as, employees of the app or something, right? They're not our drivers actually, right? So they're just independent contractors. And the reason they're doing this is to get out of essentially the social contract that we have in most Western countries where, look, if you're going to be someone's employer, you're going to pay into social programs like EI, like CPP, right? almost every other employer agrees to the social contract, and this is just sort of a new wave of trying to skirt around that social contract and get out of paying into these social programs that for so long employers have been. So, you know, it's a complicated question because you have to look at it sort of a two-pronged approach. How do we affect this change on an organizing kind of interpersonal level, like through our actual sort of solidarity and collective action, but you can also look at this on a policy level, and how do we affect policy? And you know, you'd be naive to think that the other side is not already actively trying to make policy much worse for us, right? Uber is actively lobbying our governments, even here in Ontario, with their, I believe it's called the Flexible Work Plus campaign, some bullshit like that. But you know, they did the same thing in California, right, where they made these laws much worse for the actual freelancers themselves. So again, don't be naive to think that just because you're doing organizing work that you can kind of ignore the policy side of this, that you can ignore the legislative side of this, because the employers sure aren't. So we have to take this as sort of a two-pronged approach and take both of them seriously.
The only thing I could add to this conversation is when I started in journalism, and that's about 20 years ago now, the freelance rates have not changed since then. They have not. Like, you know, you cap out at, if you're lucky, finding a publication that pays $2 a word, and that's very, very, very rare. I mean, usually you'll see $1 a word or less, 50 cents a word, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's a huge problem. And freelancing it can be for many people a very good lifestyle choice, and it affords you the ability to do the kinds of stories that you really want to do. But if there's no pay for it, this is a huge problem. But on the other side of things too, and it gets to the cultural aspect of it as well, I think there still can be lingering attitudes within newsrooms like, oh, that person's just a freelancer, and that cultural aspect will need to change as well. Especially if you have newsrooms that are relying more and more on freelance content, then there's a shift that needs to be done there.
Thank you. Yeah. And Wency, I hope you can lead off this question, since you brought again up the question of a culture and questions of lifestyle of the newsroom as they brush up against lifestyle everywhere outside the newsroom. And I'd wonder, what is the discourse about work in digital newsrooms and within digital media unions now doing to address the ways that the expectations of journalistic work has not always accommodated people of differing like race, genders, and sexualities?
I think, at least I hope that most newsrooms now recognize the need for more gender diversity and racial diversity. But yeah, the change is slow. Yeah, it's coming though. I think you know, whether it's something that is, you know, yeah, I think change will have to come sooner or later. And yeah, hope that answers your question.
It's coming. Watch out. Okay. Nicole?
I mean, I guess I would say I don't think change will just happen. As much as, like, I think journalists have been fighting this fight for a long time. This is not like new, even though we're paying more attention to it. But you know, I really think this recent wave of, and I don't want to be too romantic and, you know, rosy about it, but like they've really foregrounded the need to address diversity and equity in newsrooms. And again, you know, how do you do that? Well, they're bargaining these things into their collective agreements. So there's now collective agreements, you know, I think in Canada too, maybe now, so you have more familiarity with this. Some of them are newer that I haven't seen, but you know, you have to interview now. Management has to interview people from underrepresented groups in the newsroom. Like, this is a huge struggle. I'm not saying this is easy. This takes like years at a negotiating table, but they're negotiating in provisions for recruitment. Like it says in collective bargaining agreements now, you have to post openings at certain professional associations that like racialized journalists belong to, or certain journalism programs that will have a higher proportion of working class or racialized journalists. And they're bargaining in protections for people. So like once you get into the newsroom, how are you treated, and are there supports for your career to develop? It's really interesting, and I think just even the fact, like, someone I interviewed recently called it like diversity adjacent or equity adjacent clauses, but you know, things like base salaries that are fair and equitable, right? That actually is a way to bring the people at the very bottom up to a like more equitable level. Or just cause, which is a provision the American newsrooms are really fighting for. Having, you know, you have to have a reason to fire someone gives people who feel and are more marginalized place to talk back or to stand up for themselves or to push back against like an editorial idea they don't agree with. So I think looking at how these newsrooms are putting into practice things that I think companies have said they'll do for a long time, like we'll hire more people or we'll have a diversity committee. Again, depending on the way the union is organized and mobilized, they've actually been able to bring in some change on paper at least.
Part of that too is like having transparency about, you know, I have no idea what my colleagues make, and so
Exactly.
so you know, when we talk about like gender pay gaps or racial pay gaps, like a lot of that is unknown. Like I just have no idea, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to that is, you know, certainly I think these practices that are sort of being negotiated in there, the important thing is that there's enforcement mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
So that there's a way to sort of demand proof of the employer that they're doing what they've sort of agreed to in these collective agreements, right? And so I think that's really important. And I think just the big takeaway for me, you know, being a part of some of these organizing drives, is that this is not a divisive issue. I think sometimes a lot of folks coming to labor think that, you know, oh, we want to help young people, so the old people got to be upset, right? We want to help racialized people, so the white folk got to be upset. Well, we're actually seeing the exact opposite, right? And I think that's a really inspiring thing, actually. Like, you're seeing real solidarity in action where, you know, at the end of the day, like, finding out your coworkers being paid $20,000 less than you should infuriate you. Just like finding out that, you know, we have, you know, 3% diverse people in this office, and it's, you know, specifically linked to hiring practices done by the employer. Like, that should infuriate you, and that's what we're seeing, because we're seeing, you know, offices filled with, you know, maybe hegemonic democratic sort of, excuse me, I should say, demographic makeup, saying that this should be a primary issue for us. It's not just wages, right? Sometimes when you focus simply on wages, you kind of miss the forest for the trees, right? There are other issues that we can organize around. And so it's been really inspiring that people aren't having to be dragged kicking and screaming to make this a primary issue to organize around. In fact, they're coming to us telling us this is a problem and that they want it to change. So I think that's you know, a really inspiring thing that we're actually seeing.
Thank you. So I have a question that maybe Wency again can lead, given and with the ongoing within this ongoing pandemic and after the early onset of COVID-19, reorganizing what it means to be at work and relocating people or annihilating employment the world over. How would you assess your own or others' attitudes towards journalistic labor, and that move to organize has changed in the past unprecedented 20 months and ongoing?
I would say, like, one thing that happened during the pandemic that had never happened before is my editor told myself and my colleagues to take breaks. And that I had never had an editor tell me that before. And I think hopefully people in management positions do kind of recognize the need to protect the well-being of reporters, and to make sure that they're not kind of overexerting themselves in their work. So that I see as a positive development. But the other thing is, I see like both myself and also my colleagues are starting to kind of think about our identities beyond our work selves. And you know, try to not just define who we are by the work that we do. So those are kind of the two things that I see happening.
Nicole?
I mean, I'm not a working journalist, so I don't know that I could add to that. I'll just say that I see a lot of parallels with academic work. So I'll just leave it at that for now, maybe.
Nasser?
I'm sorry, so the question was?
Yeah, like in the onset of the pandemic, has this attitude towards labor and also organizing shifted at all?
I think it's lit a fire under people, that's for certain, right? I think, you know, to Wency, your point earlier that, you know, just because you belong to a union doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a culture of mobilization and activation in the office. You know, I think a great example, members of ours at CBC in Toronto here, there were certain provisions in the contract where essentially, you know, temporary workers would not be given like sick days or the specific health benefits, basically. And you know, pretty much March 15th of 2020 hit, right? And everyone's going into lockdown. And so, you know, full-timers get the benefit of being able to stay home when they have a little tickle in their throat, but the temp workers don't. It made absolutely no sense. So what did these temp workers do? They self-organized and virtually overnight had a petition circulating where they got hundreds of signatures in the span of a few hours. Didn't even actually call the union. Like, they genuinely were just like, nope, we're doing this ourselves. Screw it, let's do it right now. And within 24 hours, they changed the policy. They actually went and changed the collective agreement to sort of answer these demands. So I think it has lit a fire under people, like Nicole also was mentioning earlier, this wave of digital media organizing. The wave itself has kind of kicked into high gear during the pandemic, right? We've had workers come to us that we've never met before. The entire organizing drive has taken place on Zoom, right? Like, these things are actually happening. So I will say, I think, you know, this kind of unique situation that we're in has kind of lit that fire even brighter. Yeah.
Keep those flames going. I have one more question before we perhaps open it up to the audience and here and also online. And now is your chance to ask for things. Like, wildest dreams, what can we as institutions in the university, as future policymakers, as Massey College, and or future venture capitalists, stakeholders, whatever in the world right now, do to service your jobs and, you know, journalists at this moment? What do you need from us? Nasser.
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually. And I think the way I'll answer it is this, is that for a very long time, I think when workers in general have stood up for themselves, have fought for their rights, whether that's you know, taking a workplace action or going as far as going on strike, there's a long storied history of demonizing those workers. I think particularly when we look at public sector workers, I think is where it's kind of most seen. Certainly if a group of teachers are, you know, even into pandemic, fighting for better ventilation so that they don't get sick and you know, people's children don't get sick, I should say, and they go on strike, right? The Chicago teachers in the US come to mind as a particularly great example of this. We have seen time and time again the sanitation workers in Toronto a few years ago, right? Like, we've seen the demonization of these workers time and time again. Unfortunately, even sometimes by the very media that we're talking about. And so I think when you ask, what can these institutions do? What can these organizations do? What can powerful people do? You know, it's not doing that. It's not demonizing these workers. It's respecting what they're asking for. It's also things like showing up to picket lines. It's donating to strike funds, right? Reprinting and republishing the union communiques, right, from the workers themselves. It's at the very least not crossing a picket line, right? So there's big things and there's little things that can be done. But certainly I think it all starts with respecting what they're actually doing, which is fighting for better rights and protections at work. And not actively doing the work of their bosses for them by demonizing them and putting them in a negative light and essentially framing to the public or your employees or whatever have you, your audience, framing them in a negative light. So I think that's a really key thing and not something that's asking the world either.
Wency from the newsrooms.
My request is like on the very small level. It's just pay for journalism. That's that's it.
Pay for journalism?
Yeah.
Could you clarify that? You mean like?
Oh yeah. So when you know. Subscribe. Yeah, that's. I really don't have like bigger demands than that, but yeah.
And Nicole.
Yeah, I guess I would say as researchers, just doing research on labor, and I see two people doing research on journalistic labor sitting right here, so that's wonderful, the Faculty of Information. And making space in the Academy for this, having these conversations. I don't think it's typical, I have to say, and depending on the institution. But yeah, like also, I've done some collaborations with Nasser. We just made an animated video on organizing your newsroom. So, you know, making our research useful, I think, to the publics that we want to research with and for, I think is one thing that we can do as scholars and academics, which is already being done here, so that's really exciting.
Thank you, Nicole. And now we would like to open it up first to in-person questions, if any. Thank you, Kim. We have Kim.
Hi. You've talked a lot about, once the young people get out into the workforce and they become, perpetual freelancers or whatever, the insecurities. What role can journalism schools play because they're kind of the training grounds in many cases, and what are they doing well and what are they not doing well? Thank you, Kim.
Nasser, do you want to take that?
It's an excellent question, and I think it's a good panel to talk about this. Nicole is a professor here, and part of my role at CWA Canada is sort of political education and going to actual J schools and speaking with their students. And Nicole has graciously opened up her classroom to me year after year, and I think while there's a lot, I think that can be discussed here, I think the most important one is sort of, yes, there's the teaching genuinely about things like negotiating rates and talking about organizing when you get into a newsroom, and all those things are excellent, but it's like practice what you preach, right? This very notion of unpaid internships needs to end. Like point blank, right? Like full stop. These are not beneficial to these students. I don't care how you spin this stuff. This is something I'm very animated about, and I will always be, because at the end of the day, this is something that benefits the employer and it benefits the educational institution, right? The employer will get free labor, and the institution then gets to go out and say, well, 99% of our people get to go into the workplace when they graduate. Well, yeah, they have to, or they don't graduate, right? This is not a beneficial thing for the students themselves, but it is for the institution, and it is for the employer. And so ending this practice is very important. And I'll just say this, is I was for a very long time pessimistic about this, pessimistic about it ever changing, right? Because again, these laws, they're oftentimes, it's labor laws, provincially regulated. So what are we going to get, Doug Ford in Ontario and Jason Kenney in Alberta and all these different governments to make better labor laws, and then, we're at the mercy of whichever new government comes in any given province, right? Like I was pretty pessimistic that this would change. And then a couple students at Concordia University a couple years ago went on strike. Their journalism department went on strike against this practice. Look, did they change the labor law? No. But they made Concordia University sit down with them and said, look, we'll change our policy. We can't change what everybody else in the province does, but we'll make it so that you can now get paid for your internship. Right? It's a little victory, but it's still a victory. And, I think things are starting to change. I think, I've heard rumblings that J School Canada is sort of having a panel together to talk about this, to take it seriously, this idea that students are upset about this, right? So, for the first time in a while, I'm hopeful, instead of being pessimistic about this, that things can sort of change. But it's, in my opinion, the most important. Because how are you going to tell these students that they should negotiate and fight for themselves when they can't even do so at the very first ever employment opportunity that they have?
Kim, this doesn't answer your question at all, but I think like one of the things that we have to keep in mind, though, is that precarity doesn't just affect the young new generation that's coming in. It also affects the established journalists and senior journalists as well, who at any moment could have the rug pulled out under their feet. So. And there are many seasoned journalists out there who are out of work, and we kind of have to look at that end of the spectrum as well, and not just think of like, oh, it's like these old codgers have like done their time and now like off they go with their packages, like this. We have to kind of think of the whole spectrum, I think.
That's a great point.
Thanks. Nicole?
I mean, I would just add, when I was in journalism school, I'm sure the curriculum has changed, I hope, but just you know, teaching and encouraging an understanding of the power dynamics that operate in the industry at all the levels we've talked about. So not just talking and teaching students about labor rights or just the idea that you're going to be a worker in a workplace, but, you know, issues of race and gender and sexuality, class, like all of these, how the industry works, the policy that upholds it in this country. I think all of that is so vital so that when you get to some of the situations maybe Wency's talked about, there's some analysis that you're able to then draw on, rather than, I do think it's very, all the problems that journalists tend to face, it feels very individual at the time, like it's my own issue that I have to deal with.
Thank you, everyone. Rebecca,
Hi.
one of our journalism
Is this
fellows,
on?
has a question.
Yeah. I have a couple of comments and then a question. First of all, Nasser, to what you just said about the journalism internships being unpaid, I think there's another really important point to that is who can afford to take an unpaid internship like that. Like I couldn't have afforded to do it. Luckily my internship in journalism was paid, but I couldn't have afforded to like work for 4 months for free. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the unpaid internship scheme, which goes well beyond journalism to many other industries, especially industries that are like considered interesting, like journalism and NGOs and like aid work and stuff. Christine, to your first question, I think that you asked me about what the biggest myths are, and I think as a person who's been freelancing for 12 years, I would say the biggest myth is that freelancers are free. I heard people talk about flexibility and all these sort of things. If you work in a news environment as a freelancer, you have no freedom. You are driven, if not by your organization, you are driven by a news agenda, and that means that you don't have any freedom. And the other thing, Nasser, you said that you think you're talking about your friends who are like influencers or work on, and you said their boss is the algorithm, and I think you missed the point that all of our boss is now the algorithm. So like I work for Legacy Media, friends of mine who work for Legacy Media who are employees even get talked to about traffic all the time. So the algorithm is not just controlling like people who work primarily in these sort of like social media settings, but it's controlling all of us. And I think we need to think a lot about what that means for the kind of journalism we produce, because the stories that I think are most important are not the ones that get the most traffic, and it's affecting all of us. And then, sorry, Nicole, you said something about, you made a really good point, which I think is important. Like we're talking about unions, like they're almost irrelevant to most of us now. Most people are freelancers, so like I'm not allowed to be part of a union. So what do unions mean when you have so much of the journalistic content today being produced by freelancers? And I'll just say one other thing. I've been told several times when I've been like, give me a job, they're like, oh, but the union requires now that we interview this person. So there's something that's happening that I think is there's probably some truth to it, but I think a lot of it is exaggerated, which is like that they kind of pit freelancers against the union. And I guess my question for you, Nicole, is like how do we navigate that? What is the solution to that? And do you think it's real, or it's just something that kind of people in power are using to make freelancers feel like the problem is not the leadership but the union? Sorry.
Great points, all of them. I wholeheartedly agree. And yeah, I think that bosses are really good at pitting workers against each other, all kinds of workers. So the issue of freelancing and outsourcing work, which is to freelancers, has been really contentious. I think part of it is the union itself. So we're talking about a diverse group of organizations, different parent unions with different histories, different models of organizing, some very worker-led, some very top-down. So it's very diverse in that respect. But I think that if you want to get down to it, there are freelancers are doing what they've done for a long time to try and organize. I think the Freelance Solidarity Project in the US has hammered out some agreements with a few publications. These are small independent publications. These are not like the New York Times. And in Canada, that was the case when Professional Writers Association of Canada, maybe it was the Periodical Writers Association of Canada, which doesn't exist anymore. Anyway, when it started in the 70s, they also got some agreements with some magazines. But, to get a real, to build power is really difficult. So I actually think, and I've talked to people who are members of negotiating committees and organizing committees, that if there is this solidarity between freelancers and staff journalists, then at some point, maybe there's a way to bring freelancers' concerns to the table. I think unions are doing it with like perma-lancers. So people, once you're like basically full-time but classified as freelance for a year, you get converted into full-time. Different than...
I know specifically in the CBC CBC context, because a lot of people I know at CBC are permanent freelancers, there is an effort to make sure that doesn't happen. So
Yes,
they
exactly.
make sure that
Totally.
they don't meet the
threshold.
Yes.
threshold for that. So what?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, are there ways to make sure, look, what are the big issues freelancers face? Can they get paid on time? Is that something staff can negotiate? I don't know. Is there a way to raise the rates? I don't know. So these are really vital questions.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes left. Would you, we're like Mileti?
Thank you for this fantastic panel and amazing questions, Christine. I wanted to piggyback on a question that you had about content creators and the sea of content that we live in. And particularly the kind of fuzzy boundaries around who is a journalist anymore, particularly when you don't have an institution giving you the stamp of journalist. Now it's a platform or you're kind of doing it on your own. So how do unions respond to this? Do unions need to broaden who falls under the contours of a journalist who can be represented? How is a union equipped to respond to the increasing fuzziness of who a journalist even is?
Thanks, Mileti. With our last 5 minutes, anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and I think there's kind of two strains of thought to look at it through, right? Like there's this sort of, in the world of journalism, right? Like how do other journalists sort of perceive Patreon writers and all those sorts of things? I think as a union, we need to look at it more on a base worker level, right? Is this an organization with an employer, with employees, right? And we don't care if people went to journalism school at the end of the day, right? If people are in formal employment relationships with an employer and they want to get organized and they reach out to us, then we'll help them do that work, right? So I think those questions about who is not a journalist, they're murkier questions for the journalism community itself. I think as a labor union, we need to look at it purely as a worker and employer relationship. And if they fall under that banner, right, that we work for this employer and we want to improve our conditions by organizing, and they reach out to us, like we'll do that, right? So I think I hope that answers the question, and I hope that's not brushing it aside either. I just think that where that question becomes murky is in the newsroom itself, really.
With our last few minutes, it looks like Principal Tavasi has a question.
Well, I wanted to draw a little bit on a parallel in terms of academic life and the way in which many universities organize the way in which they have permanent faculty, but they also have a large part-time group. And the reconciliation between the part-time union and the full-time union needs some work, but it is happening, and it has raised the salaries of the part-time workers. So, and that's what you want. You actually want to have, and it's been done. It's not the idea that, and there are ways in which not only raising the part-time work actually may favor as well the full-time workers who should be concerned about what's going on because they could be there and they might be there and so on. And there's ways in which that dynamic ought to be valued and experimented with. Like to me, I'm surprised that the definitional problem is so compound because it's been in other industries. It's been, I mean, if somebody teaches one course, doesn't matter whether they teach 7 or 1. It's the idea of paying the same price for that course as it would be for anybody else, and that would help everyone. So I just wondered whether, just to finish on this, there's also a lot of academics who are forced now to become a star on social media, and so there are some similarities, and I know Nicole mentioned it a little bit, but I thought there might be some ways in which to think about how did it happen else in other industries that they dealt with the part-timer or the freelancer. Not always very good, but there may be some avenues.
Anyone want to comment?
I guess I'll just say, I think these are political questions. Like there's the technical aspect of who a union can organize legally, but the political question around solidarity and how you build that and have in other sectors and how hard it is, I think that is like the vital question around organizing in this sphere.
Right. Thank you, everybody. Any last words as we wrap up this lovely, lovely panel? One last punched bow. Well, thank you so much for coming together to us to discuss cultural workers as they organize around words and news. And thank you to our lovely guests for attending. A round of applause for our beautiful attendees.